January 29th, 1945, 14:47 hours, whole time, Belgium. A small Ardennes village of stone farmhouses and narrow lanes under overcast winter light. Snow depth roughly 30 to 50 centimeters in open ground. Surface friction high enough to slow running men to a shuffle and to prevent rapid turning movement by any unit that is already dispersed among buildings. Company C, 1st Battalion, 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division, is operating below authorized strength after the Ardennes fighting, clearing the village by building-to-building method because the terrain enforces short sightlines, masked approaches, and line-of-fire discontinuities that make a continuous perimeter impractical without more manpower than the company can field. The tactical map reads secured, only because resistance has collapsed into isolated pockets. But secured, in this environment, is a temporary state, dependent on rear area control, prisoner handling, and the ability to move captured personnel out of the immediate battle space before they become an internal variable again. And that is the first point where the system is already running at its limit. Approximately 80 German soldiers have been captured during the assault and consolidation, disarmed, and concentrated in the yard of a farmhouse near the village center as a temporary holding point. Because evacuation assets are not immediately available and the company cannot pause clearance operations to build a dedicated prisoner transport and escort package, 4 American guards are assigned, not because doctrine endorses a 20-to-1 prisoner-to-guard ratio, but because the forward problem consumes rifles, and every man moved to guard duty is a man removed from the sequence of building entry, room clearance, and local security that prevent stragglers from reconstituting behind the line. The technical anchor in this segment is custody capacity. Prisoner control is bounded by manpower, and manpower is already allocated to forward clearance, producing a guard detail that functions only as long as the prisoners remain psychologically and physically separated from weapons, mobility, and external reinforcement. That separation fails within minutes, not through a frontal assault, but through a rear area penetration that uses the environment as camouflage and the American operational tempo as cover. A German patrol, estimated 10 to 20 men, approaches the farmhouse wearing winter camouflage that reduces contrast and delays identification at the exact ranges where reaction time is shortest. The approach is not detected early enough for the 4 guards to form a firing solution or to reposition to cover, because the observation angles are constrained by buildings and the sound environment is saturated by ongoing clearing action elsewhere. The patrol overwhelms the guards at close range, disarms them, and forces them to kneel in snow with hands behind their heads. And the prisoners, German soldiers who were restrained by procedure 20 minutes earlier, are now released into the same physical space where confiscated rifles and equipment remain accessible. The technical anchor here is weapon proximity. Disarmament is not neutralization if the weapons remain within reach inside a fluid rear area, because the time required for rearming can be less than the time required for the capturing unit to recognize that control has been lost. Once freed, the group expands to roughly 90 German soldiers as the patrol merges with the released prisoners, and the reorganizing process begins immediately because the plan is simple and the objective is local. Strike Company C from the rear, while its elements are dispersed across multiple buildings and therefore unable to present a unified line of fire. A German officer takes command and begins issuing orders. The group starts redistributing weapons, orienting men, and preparing to move. And this phase is structurally fragile because it depends on command continuity and time. 2 things the Germans cannot guarantee in a cold: confined space, where any interruption forces improvisation under stress. The technical anchor in this segment is deployment window. The Germans must complete organization before the Americans reconverge or receive warning, and the entire plan exists inside a narrow temporal corridor measured in minutes, which is shorter than the cycle required for Company C to pull itself together if hit unexpectedly from behind. At approximately 1447 to 1500 hours, First Sergeant Leonard Funk Jr., acting company executive officer in practice, because the company is understrength and leadership losses have compressed responsibility downward, walks back toward the farmhouse to check the prisoner situation as a routine control action, not as a response to a report, because there's no report. Funk is armed with an M1A1 Thompson submachine gun chambered in .45 ACP, typical cyclic rate around 600 rounds per minute, magazine capacity 30 rounds. with a close-range lethality profile that is disproportionate inside 10 meters, but that is mechanically limited by magazine depletion and reload time. He rounds the corner of the farmhouse and stops because the spatial picture resolves instantly. Roughly 90 armed enemy soldiers in a confined yard, 4 American guards kneeling and disarmed, and an armed German officer stepping forward to impose control at point-blank distance. The officer presses an MP-40 into Funk's abdomen, a 9 by 19 mm submachine gun capable of lethal effect at this range with essentially no warning, and he shouts commands in German that Funk does not understand. What Funk does understand is geometry and time. Because distance to immediate cover is negligible, distance to friendly support is too large given the occluding buildings, and the time available for any external rescue is effectively infinite compared to the seconds available before the officer decides to fire. The technical anchor here is decision latency. In a point-blank confrontation, the usable time is shorter than any communication, maneuver, or reinforcement cycle, forcing the entire outcome to be decided by actions that occur inside a few seconds. Funk does not comply, not because he has an abstract intent to perform heroism, but because surrender is not a stable option in a rear area collapse where the enemy has just demonstrated the ability to neutralize guards and rearm prisoners. Surrender would transfer control entirely to a system that has already broken containment, and that is a survival calculation under uncertainty rather than a moral stance. He begins to laugh, and the value of that action is not theatrical but functional. It injects an anomalous behavioral signal into an interaction that relies on predictable compliance, and the officer's decision process slows because the expected script fails. The officer shouts louder, his face tight with anger, but the seconds accumulate, and in an environment where the Germans have not yet completed their own internal organization for the rear attack, those seconds are the only resource Funk can create, without cover, without maneuver, and without help. The technical anchor in this segment is command disruption. By producing an unexpected response, Funk increases the officer's hesitation just long enough to open a micro window in which the officer's control is not absolute. Inside that window, Funk reaches for the Thompson in a motion that the officer misclassifies as surrender and weapon handover. Because surrender behavior is what the officer expects, and because the immediate goal is to secure the American leader as a prisoner rather than to execute him in front of 90 men whose compliance is still being organized. Funk's hand closes on the weapon. He transitions from sling position to firing position in one continuous movement and fires at point-blank range, where dispersion is irrelevant and the limiting factor is mechanical. Approximately 10 rounds per second at 600 revolutions per minute, meaning a 30-round magazine can be emptied in roughly 3 seconds. The first burst kills the officer before any new order can be issued. That kill matters more than the body count because it removes the single command node holding the newly freed group together, and without that node the Germans revert to individual reaction rather than coordinated action. Some attempt to return fire, some freeze, some drop weapons, and in that confusion Funk's shouted instruction, "Seize weapons," becomes executable because his 4 guards are within arm's reach of rifles falling into the snow. The technical anchor here is tempo dominance. Funk's rate of action exceeds the enemy's ability to reestablish command, and the engagement becomes a race between his reload cycle and their recovery cycle. The reload cycle is the mechanical cliff. When the magazine empties, Funk must reload fast enough to prevent the Germans from regaining coherent fire. A trained reload can be executed in roughly 2 seconds. Under fire, 2 seconds is an eternity, but it is still shorter than the time required for a disorganized group to reconstitute a plan, especially after the officer's death. Funk reloads, continues firing, and the guards rearm and contribute fire, turning the yard into a lethal convergence point where Germans are being hit without a clear direction of control. Within less than 60 seconds, 21 German soldiers are dead and roughly 24 are wounded, and the remainder surrender because their survival probability collapses once leadership is removed and once the expected rear attack turns into a killing zone inside a confined space with no prepared exit. The technical anchor here is irreversible cascade. After a certain level of shock and leader loss, reorganizing a force takes more time than the environment allows, and surrender becomes the only available stable state. The tactical outcome is immediate. Company C avoids a rear area strike that could have produced disproportionate casualties while the company was dispersed in village clearance, and the prisoner problem is reset under heavier guard and faster evacuation once the hazard is recognized. The operational meaning is broader. This is not primarily a story about a man defeating 90 with skill alone, but a case study in how late war combat creates brittle rear areas where custody, transport, and manpower constraints form failure points, and how small disruptions, seconds of hesitation, a single command node removed, a weapon matched to short-range geometry, can decide whether a company stays coherent or fractures. The strategic war does not pivot on whole time, but the war that individual units experience is made of exactly these compressions, where the boundary between secured and catastrophe is measured not in kilometers or days, but in meters and seconds, and where the decisive variable is whether a system can maintain control when its assumptions, prisoners remain disarmed, rear areas are safe, command is stable, are violated without warning. The events at whole time do not exist in isolation from the larger operational condition of the Western Front in early 1945. They are a local expression of a system already stretched beyond its nominal design limits by tempo, attrition, and geography. After the failure of the German Ardennes offensive in December 1944, Allied forces resumed forward movement not as a single coherent wave, but as a series of overlapping thrusts conducted by units that are often under strength, unevenly supplied, and operating in terrain that compresses frontage while multiplying friction. Snow, damaged infrastructure, and civilian-built environments constrain visibility and movement, forcing infantry formations to accept dispersion as a default state rather than an exception. And this dispersion alters the balance between offensive reach and internal control. For airborne units, like the 82nd Airborne Division, this condition is particularly acute. These formations are optimized for rapid seizure of key terrain, aggressive patrolling, and decentralized initiative, but they are not optimized for sustained prisoner management, rear area security, or static control tasks that normally fall to follow-on forces. In January 1945, follow-on forces are delayed, rerouted, or exhausted by the same logistical bottlenecks that affect frontline units. As a result, airborne infantry finds itself performing hybrid roles: assault troops, occupation force, and ad hoc military police simultaneously. The technical anchor at this level is role saturation, the point at which a unit is asked to perform more distinct functions than its manpower and structure can reliably support without degradation in at least one area. Whole time illustrates how that degradation manifests. The capture of 80 German soldiers is, on paper, a success, but each captured enemy increases the internal load on the company without increasing its combat power. Prisoners require guards, guards reduce rifle strength, and reduced rifle strength increases dispersion during clearance operations, which in turn increases the probability of unobserved enemy movement. This is a feedback loop, not a linear problem, and it accelerates under winter conditions where reaction times are slower and fatigue accumulates faster. In such a loop, a single external input, a patrol appearing in the rear, can flip the system from stable to unstable in minutes. From the German side, the same conditions invert incentives. German forces in January 1945 are no longer structured for sustained defensive action, but they retain cohesion at the small unit level and are conditioned to exploit momentary opportunities created by Allied overextension. The patrol that reaches the farmhouse at whole time is not executing a grand plan. It is reacting to sound, movement, and chance contact in an environment where the front is porous. The decision to free prisoners and attempt a rear attack is opportunistic, but it is rational within a collapsing operational framework where delay favors the stronger opponent. The technical anchor here is asymmetry of stakes. For the Germans, failure costs little beyond what is already likely. For the Americans, failure could mean sudden casualties inflicted by forces assumed neutralized. Leonard Funk's position as acting company executive officer places him precisely at the intersection of these pressures. He is not merely an individual with a weapon. He is a node of command responsibility operating without the buffers normally provided by intact staff structures, reliable communications, or depth of manpower. His return to the prisoner area is itself a corrective action aimed at reducing uncertainty, because uncertainty in rear areas is more dangerous than uncertainty at the point of contact. The moment he encounters the rearmed German group, the problem ceases to be tactical in the conventional sense and becomes systemic. Either the rear area failure propagates forward into the company's clearing elements, or it is terminated immediately at its source. The engagement that follows is often summarized in terms of numbers and seconds, but its decisive quality lies in sequencing rather than scale. Funk's actions compress the decision cycle below the enemy's ability to respond coherently, not because he possesses superior firepower in absolute terms, but because his weapon position and training align with the spatial constraints of the yard and the psychological shock created by the officer's death. The Thompson's high close-range lethality, the absence of prepared German firing positions, and the instantaneous loss of centralized command combined to produce a rapid collapse that no amount of numerical superiority can reverse once it begins. The technical anchor here is O-D loop inversion. Funk's observe, orient, decide, act cycle completes faster than the German group can transition from shock to coordinated response. In the immediate aftermath, Company C resumes consolidation under heightened awareness of rear area vulnerability. Prisoner handling procedures are adjusted on the fly, guards reinforced, and evacuation prioritized. These adjustments are local and improvised, but they reflect lessons already being learned across the front, that the distinction between front line and rear area is increasingly artificial in high-tempo infantry operations, and that any assumption of safety must be continuously validated rather than passively accepted. Hold time becomes one data point among many that inform post-action reports, recommendations, and informal doctrinal shifts, even if it is remembered publicly through the lens of individual valor rather than systemic failure narrowly averted. What makes the episode durable in military analysis is not its improbability but its clarity. It strips away abstractions and reveals the mechanics of control under stress, how manpower shortages distort risk calculations, how custody without depth becomes temporary at best, how command loss multiplies chaos, and how seconds gained or lost at the point of contact can determine whether a localized failure remains contained or detonates outward. In this sense, Hold Time is less a story about how one man killed 21 opponents than about how modern war, when compressed by terrain, weather, and tempo, creates moments where individual action is no longer buffered by system resilience, and where the system either recovers immediately or not at all. Seen at higher resolution, Hold Time aligns with a pattern that emerges repeatedly in late-stage industrial wars, where the decisive risks no longer originate primarily from enemy mass, but from internal overload within advancing forces. By early 1945, Allied command enjoys overwhelming superiority in armor, air power, and logistics at the theater level, yet at the company and platoon level this superiority is filtered through terrain, weather, and exhaustion in ways that flatten those advantages. Units advance faster than infrastructure can support them, faster than prisoners can be processed, and faster than command layers can reconstitute depth behind the forward edge. The result is a battle space filled with nominally friendly rear areas that are functionally unsecured, not because of negligence, but because securing them would require manpower and time that the operational tempo does not allow. This condition produces a specific kind of vulnerability, not a breach from the front, but a reversal from within. Prisoners, civilians, damaged enemy units, and friendly elements all coexist in compressed spaces where the distinction between combatant and non-combatant, controlled and uncontrolled, becomes unstable. The technical anchor at this level is control density, the ratio between the number of elements requiring supervision and the number of personnel available to provide it. When control density falls below a certain threshold, the system relies on assumptions rather than enforcement, and assumptions are fragile under stress. Hold Time crosses that threshold the moment 80 prisoners are held with 4 guards, while the rest of the company continues forward movement. The German attempt to exploit this condition is not exceptional. What is exceptional is how cleanly the mechanics are exposed. The German patrol does not need numerical parity or heavy weapons. It needs only access to prisoners, proximity to unsecured weapons, and enough time to issue initial orders. Once those conditions exist, the rear attack becomes feasible even without coordination with higher headquarters. This reflects a broader late-war German tactical reality, in which decentralized initiative compensates, imperfectly but persistently, for the loss of strategic freedom. The technical anchor here is opportunity elasticity. In a fragmented front, small opportunities expand rapidly if not immediately suppressed, because there is no depth behind them to absorb failure. Leonard Funk's intervention terminates that expansion at its point of origin. What matters analytically is not his courage in isolation, but the way his actions reintroduce decisive asymmetry into a moment that had briefly become symmetrical in terms of immediate threat. Before he fires, the Germans possess local superiority in numbers and weapons, but they lack stabilized command and prepared fields of fire. Funk lacks numbers but possesses a weapon optimized for the exact range and geometry of the encounter, and he operates within a decision window that precedes enemy consolidation. The technical anchor is timing relative to organization. Funk acts before the Germans complete the transition from released prisoners to a functioning assault element, and once the transition is interrupted, it cannot be resumed under fire. This interruption has cascading effects. The death of the German officer does not merely remove a leader. It collapses the coordination mechanism that would allow individual soldiers to interpret the situation consistently. Without shared intent, numerical strength fragments into isolated reactions, and isolated reactions are vulnerable to suppression by even a small number of determined defenders. The Guard's rapid rearmament compounds this effect, transforming the engagement from a one-man action into a localized fire superiority problem that the Germans are structurally unprepared to solve in that space. The technical anchor here is command dependency. When a group's effectiveness is disproportionately tied to a single command node, the loss of that node produces a nonlinear drop in combat capability. At the company level, the prevention of a rear attack preserves not only lives but coherence. A successful German strike from behind during village clearance would likely have forced Company C into a reactive posture, pulling squads out of buildings, disrupting clearance sequences, and creating opportunities for remaining German pockets to reassert themselves. Even a brief disruption could have produced friendly fire incidents, isolated casualties, or loss of momentum that would ripple upward to battalion-level timelines. Whole time avoids this not because the plan was flawless, but because a failure state is terminated before it propagates. The technical anchor here is failure containment. Stopping a breakdown early is exponentially cheaper than restoring control after it spreads. As the war moves toward its conclusion, incidents like this quietly shape post-war understanding of combat under high tempo. They inform an increased emphasis on decentralized command, faster decision cycles, and explicit recognition of rear area vulnerability even during offensive operations. They also expose the limits of doctrinal neatness in environments where units are forced to operate continuously without relief, where prisoners are taken faster than they can be processed, and where the distinction between forward and rear becomes a matter of minutes rather than kilometers. Whole time becomes part of that accumulated experience, not because it changes strategy, but because it sharpens awareness of where strategy meets friction. In this sense, the episode is less about triumph than about proximity to disaster. The conditions that made Funk's action necessary are the same conditions that characterized the final months of the European War: compressed fronts, exhausted units, improvised solutions, and systems operating without redundancy. Victory does not eliminate these conditions, it coexists with them. Whole time shows how close a winning force can come to sudden reversal when control density drops and assumptions replace enforcement, and how, in those moments, outcomes hinge on whether someone recognizes the failure state quickly enough to act before time runs out. When examined against the broader operational arc of the winter of 1944 to 1945, whole time reflects a transition phase in which Allied forces are no longer fighting to regain initiative, but to manage its consequences. After the Ardennes counteroffensive collapses, German resistance does not vanish, it fractures. Large formations lose coherence, but smaller elements remain mobile, armed, and capable of exploiting momentary lapses in control. This shifts the character of danger. The principal threat is no longer a massed breakthrough supported by armor and artillery, but a sequence of localized shocks generated by small groups acting inside spaces assumed to be safe. The technical anchor at this level is threat dispersion. Enemy capability is no longer concentrated at the front, but distributed irregularly across the depth of the advancing force, increasing the probability of rear area contact even as overall resistance declines. Allied doctrine is slow to adjust to this reality because doctrine is written for stability, not for transitional chaos. Prisoner handling procedures assume secure rear areas, reliable transport, and layer control. None of these conditions exist consistently in January 1945. Roads are clogged with traffic, damaged by weather and combat, and contested by retreating enemy elements. Communications are functional but overloaded. Units rotate too slowly to rebuild depth. In this environment, airborne infantry, designed for short, violent insertions followed by relief, becomes an occupying force without the structural tools of occupation. The technical anchor here is doctrinal mismatch. The tasks imposed by the situation exceed the design assumptions embedded in unit organization and training. Leonard Funk's background is relevant not because it predestines heroism, but because it conditions response under uncertainty. By January 1945, he has operated under conditions where isolation, incomplete information, and delayed support are normal rather than exceptional. Normandy dispersal, extended movement behind enemy lines, and repeated exposure to situations where initiative substitutes for orders have trained him to treat ambiguity as a cue for action rather than hesitation. This does not make his response inevitable, it makes it plausible. The technical anchor in this layer is experiential compression. Repeated exposure to high-risk decision environments reduces the time required to recognize failure states and to act within them. The moment at hold time compresses these elements into a single decision space, a rear area that is not secure, prisoners who are not neutralized, weapons that are not removed from reach, a command structure that exists only as long as it is actively enforced. When Funk encounters the rearmed German group, he is not responding to a tactical puzzle with multiple options. He is responding to a binary system collapse in which delay equals loss of control. The laughter, often remembered as an oddity, functions as a stress response that also disrupts the opponent's expectation cycle, but it is secondary to the core action. Immediate seizure of initiative before the Germans can transition from preparation to execution. The technical anchor here is initiative capture. Once seized, it must be exploited instantly, because any pause allows the opposing system to reconstitute. The rapid collapse of the German group after the officer's death highlights another structural asymmetry. German small unit effectiveness in late 1944 relies heavily on experienced non-commissioned officers and junior officers to impose order amid declining institutional support. When that individual is removed before redundancy forms, the unit's combat effectiveness degrades sharply. In contrast, American airborne units have begun to internalize decentralized action as a norm, allowing small groups to continue functioning even when leadership is lost. At hold time, this asymmetry plays out at close range and extreme speed. The technical anchor here is leadership redundancy. Systems that distribute initiative recover faster than those that concentrate it. The immediate result is tactical survival, but the longer-term consequence is informational. Incidents like hold time circulate informally through regiments and divisions, shaping behavior even when they do not produce formal doctrinal change. Guards become more alert. Prisoners are searched more aggressively. Weapons are moved farther away. Rear area assumptions are questioned. These adjustments are incremental and uneven, but they reflect a learning process driven by proximity to failure rather than by abstract instruction. The technical anchor at this level is adaptive learning. Feedback from near disasters alters behavior faster than top-down directives in high-tempo environments. Hold time, therefore, occupies a particular analytical space. It is not representative in scale, but it is representative in structure. It shows how modern war, especially in its final phases, is governed by systems operating close to saturation, where success depends less on overwhelming force than on the ability to recognize and arrest failure before it cascades. In such systems, individual actions matter not because individuals transcend the system, but because they operate at points where the system has no buffer left. Funk's action does not contradict the logic of industrial warfare. It exposes it, revealing how, under extreme compression, control becomes fragile and seconds become decisive. As Allied forces continue eastward in early 1945, these dynamics repeat across countless villages, road junctions, and temporary holding areas. Most do not produce Medal of Honor citations. Many produce casualties that never enter popular memory. Hold time stands out because the failure was stopped cleanly and decisively at the moment of its inception, allowing later analysis to isolate variables that are usually obscured by confusion and loss. It remains a case study not in audacity, but in the mechanics of survival inside a system that is winning the war while still capable of sudden, lethal breakdowns. Placed against the closing weeks of the European campaign, Hold time also clarifies a paradox that defines victorious armies near the end of large-scale wars. Operational success increases exposure to internal risk faster than it reduces external threat. As German formations lose the ability to hold continuous fronts, Allied units are compelled to advance into spaces where control has not yet been rebuilt, inheriting responsibility for terrain, populations, prisoners, and infrastructure simultaneously. Each kilometer gained expands the surface area that must be managed. Each village secured creates a temporary rear that exists without depth. The technical anchor at this level is frontage expansion. Progress stretches control thinner, and thinning control raises the probability that small, armed elements can generate outsized effects before being detected. This paradox undermines intuitive assumptions about late war safety. By January 1945, Allied soldiers are statistically more likely to die in sudden, close-range encounters than in set-piece engagements, because the latter have already been won at the strategic level. What remains are pockets, patrols, and breakdowns at points where administrative functions collide with combat functions. Prisoner handling is emblematic of this collision. Captured enemy soldiers are no longer just an intelligence or humanitarian concern. They are a kinetic variable that must be neutralized continuously until removed from the system. When removal lags, risk accumulates invisibly. Hold time exposes this accumulation in real time, showing how a backlog of prisoners converts directly into combat potential when the custodial chain fails. Leonard Funk's actions can therefore be read as a corrective input injected into an unstable system at precisely the moment when negative feedback becomes possible. His response does not restore ideal conditions. It restores minimum viability. After the engagement, Company C does not suddenly gain manpower, transport, or secure rear areas. What it gains is time. Time to reassert custody, time to redistribute guards, time to evacuate prisoners, and time to continue clearing operations without being attacked from behind. The technical anchor here is time recovery. By stopping a failure early, the system regains enough temporal margin to prevent secondary failures that would otherwise cascade outward. From a doctrinal perspective, hold time foreshadows post-war shifts in how armies conceptualize rear areas in fluid operations. The idea of a clearly delineated, safe rear becomes increasingly untenable as mobility and tempo increase. Instead, rear areas are treated as zones of reduced but persistent risk, requiring active security rather than passive assumption. This shift is reflected later in doctrine emphasizing continuous rear area patrols, layered prisoner handling, and the rapid removal of captives from forward units. While these developments are shaped by many experiences, incidents like hold time provide concrete illustrations of why such measures are necessary, grounding abstract principles in lived consequences. The German failure at hold time also carries analytical weight beyond the immediate tactical loss. It demonstrates the limits of opportunistic exploitation when structural conditions are unfavorable. The Germans correctly identify an Allied vulnerability and move to exploit it, but they do so without redundancy, without prepared withdrawal routes, and without depth. Their plan depends on speed and surprise, but once surprise is lost and leadership is removed, there is no secondary mechanism to stabilize the action. This asymmetry between recognition of opportunity and ability to exploit it reflects the broader late-war German condition, tactical ingenuity constrained by systemic exhaustion. The technical anchor here is exploitation depth. Identifying a weakness is insufficient if the system cannot sustain action after initial contact. Hold time's analytical value is amplified by its brevity. The entire decisive phase unfolds in under 1 minute, compressing variables that are often spread across hours or days into a form that can be examined with unusual clarity. Weapon characteristics, human reaction times, command structures, environmental constraints, and psychological shock all interact at a pace that leaves little room for narrative embellishment. This compression strips the event of ambiguity. It becomes possible to see exactly where control fails, where it is briefly absent, and how it is reasserted. Few combat episodes offer such a clean window into the mechanics of failure and recovery under fire. As the Allied advance continues into February and March 1945, the war increasingly resembles a sequence of such compressed incidents rather than a series of grand battles. Most pass without recognition. Some end badly. A few, like hold time, are resolved in a way that preserves coherence and allows the larger operation to proceed without interruption. The significance of Leonard Funk's action lies not in its drama, but in its alignment with the underlying logic of the moment. When systems operate without buffer, survival depends on the rapid identification and termination of failure states at the lowest possible level. In this context, hold time does not contradict the notion that modern war is impersonal and system-driven. It confirms it. The episode shows that individuals matter most when systems are least able to absorb error, and that their impact is determined less by extraordinary qualities than by how precisely their actions intersect with timing, geometry, and organizational fragility. Leonard Funk's intervention succeeds because it occurs at the exact point where the system can still be salvaged, and because it is executed before inertia shifts irreversibly toward collapse. Viewed in historical scale, hold time occupies only a few dozen meters of ground and less than a minute of decisive action, yet it reveals the structural character of the final phase of the European War with unusual precision. By early 1945, the conflict has moved beyond the stage where outcomes are shaped primarily by massed maneuver and into a phase where victory depends on the ability of advancing systems to absorb friction faster than it accumulates. Allied forces possess overwhelming material superiority, but that superiority expresses itself through speed, reach, and continuous pressure rather than through static control. Speed compresses time. Reach stretches manpower. Continuous pressure removes pauses that would otherwise allow consolidation. Hold time sits exactly at the intersection of these forces, where success creates vulnerability faster than it eliminates danger. The episode demonstrates that late war combat is governed less by doctrinal ideals than by capacity limits. Prisoner handling, rear area security, and unit cohesion are not abstract administrative concerns. They are physical processes bounded by manpower, terrain, and time. When those processes fall behind the tempo of operations, the distinction between secured and unsafe collapses abruptly. In such conditions, the battlefield no longer consists of a front and a rear, but of a constantly shifting mosaic of controlled and uncontrolled spaces, each capable of producing sudden violence if assumptions replace enforcement. Hold time exposes how quickly that transition can occur and how narrow the margin for correction becomes once it does. Leonard Funk's action is best understood not as a departure from the logic of industrial warfare, but as a moment when that logic becomes visible at human scale. His decision does not override the system. It intersects with it at a point of maximum fragility. The effectiveness of his response depends on factors that are entirely impersonal: the geometry of a confined yard, the rate of fire and reload time of a specific weapon, the absence of redundant command within the opposing group, and the psychological shock produced when expected sequences fail. None of these elements are heroic in themselves. Together, they form a configuration in which seconds matter more than numbers and initiative matters more than doctrine. In this sense, hold time is not an anomaly but a distilled example of how modern war resolves itself when systems operate without buffer. As the war draws to a close, such moments become more frequent, not less, because the mechanisms that normally absorb error, depth, reserves, secure rear areas, are sacrificed to maintain momentum. Victory does not remove friction, it redistributes it. The closer an army comes to winning, the more it must manage the internal risks created by its own advance. Hold time shows how easily those risks can convert into catastrophe, and how narrowly catastrophe can be avoided. The historical importance of the episode lies in what it reveals about control under pressure. It shows that in high-tempo warfare, stability is not a permanent condition, but a temporary achievement that must be continuously renewed. It shows that command is effective only while it is actively imposed, and that once it is disrupted, recovery may be impossible within the available time. It also shows that individual action becomes decisive not because it transcends the system, but because it occurs at moments when the system has no remaining redundancy. In the broader narrative of the Second World War, hold time does not alter strategy, redraw borders, or accelerate the end of the conflict. Its value is analytical rather than transformational. It captures, in compressed form, the reality of a war won by systems, yet decided in countless moments where those systems nearly failed. Leonard Funk survives because the failure state is recognized and terminated before it propagates. Company C survives because the rear attack never materializes. The larger advance continues because coherence is preserved at the lowest level, where it can still be preserved. Seen this way, whole time stands as a reminder that even in wars of machines, logistics, and mass, the decisive variable is often the management of collapse rather than the execution of plans. The war is not decided only by how forces advance, but by how they prevent their own success from creating vulnerabilities they cannot control. In January 1945, in a snow-covered Belgian village, that lesson is written not in doctrine or theory, but in seconds, distances, and irreversible consequences.